Hi, everyone. Welcome to another session of American Public Policy Redux. So excited to have you here tonight, Thursday, March 25th, 2021. A couple of announcements. First, so today begins kind of a two-part series ish about technology and political science. And tonight we have lovely Miss Adrienne, who is joining us, St. Mary's alum. She'll do a quick background about what brought her to this topic and her love for technology. And then next week, we are continuing with Meg Goldberg, who's going to join us again, talking about polling technologies. So Adrienne is going to set us up tonight with artificial intelligence. And then Meg will bring it home with using the polling technology and advancements in that area. And then the week after that, April 8th, we are going to have Professor Mark Belanger join us, which is so exciting. I know. And so he's going to cover the broad topic of immigration. So I don't quite know which avenue he's going to go down, but we're very excited. We haven't talked about it, especially in its current, obviously, with what's going on at the southern border of the United States at the moment. So very exciting on that end. And we have a couple of other things lined up, but that just gives you a preview for tonight. As always, we are recording. So if you ask a question, you will be recorded. If you do not want to be recorded, just enter your question into the chat feature and I will read it for you. And Adrienne has asked, as always, that if you do have a question as she's chatting, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. No need to raise your hand or wait for a question answer session. And I think that's about it. Adrienne, on over to you.
All right. Hi, ladies and Pat. So excited to chat with you guys. It was interesting as I was preparing for today and thinking about the opportunity to share my background, my knowledge, what I've come to. I realized that I probably needed to tie together how artificial intelligence and politics come together in my head. And some of that probably has to do with my background. So I decided to start with a way to try to explain my journey, because it's a little different, right? So couple of things about me, right? I did Washington semester the spring of 1998. For those history buffs, that is the semester after the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. So being an intern in Washington, D.C. that semester was not necessarily the same type of intern experience that I thought it would be. And then I was a double major in political science and communications. Oops, I just went back to. And graduated in 1999 from St. Mary's. I then spent time between 1999 and 2001 in my first element of my career, which was politics. I interned at the National Republican Congressional Committee in the spring of '98 when I was there for Washington semester. When I came out of St. Mary's, I managed a political campaign for a House of Delegates race in Virginia, Mike Bacalico. I worked for a small fundraising firm called Epiphany Productions, which was also a connection through the National Republican Congressional Committee, and then worked for a House of Delegate race for an incumbent, Jack Rust, in Fairfax County. And then spent a little bit of time at the tail end of that election year working for the county party itself, because he got an opponent that needed some big consulting muscle. And in Northern Virginia, when you need big consulting muscle in an off election year, you hire the DC consultants that consult on congressional races. So I then decided to go back to my graduate program. I went back to American University, got my master's in political science with a focus on lobbying through the Campaign Management Institute. And during the classes, which were all in the evenings, I took a day job at National Public Radio in their human resources department. I kind of did it as a dare. I was looking for an opportunity to be a staffer on Capitol Hill in 2001. This is the fall of 2001. There was nobody hiring on Capitol Hill. September 11th had just happened. Everything was kind of stagnant. Bush had just gotten elected. There was very little movement. So I figured, well, let's see if a Republican can get hired at National Public Radio with the party specifically on their resume. So I did that, and they hired me. My boss was great. The collision between politics and the corporate world really shows itself in human resources, because you're required as a part of the human resources department to enforce labor policy, employment law, union contracts, all of those things. So I really saw the passion that human resources professionals have in the world of public service in the corporate world, because they really are the advocates on behalf of employees. So it was a really neat discovery of how politics was not just government entities, lobbying firms, nonprofit organizations. There's some opportunity there. So I then met my husband in 2003 and decided to relocate to Florida. And I had 3 different resumes out: a political resume, a nonprofit fundraising resume, and an HR resume. And the HR resume stuck, which meant that HR was where I needed to be. But at these three locations, NPR, KF Nanian Homes, I worked for their mortgage company, and the clerk of the court of Palm Beach County, I worked as an HR generalist, so everything involving human resources and payroll. But I was also there during major technology transformations. So the human resources discipline was going through a huge technology innovation. Big, huge software systems that were only focused on financials started to get into how do we maintain employee data. And I happened to be there during conversion. So I learned about the collision between technology and ensuring people are following the rules, right? And that was a neat bridge for me. When I was at the clerk's office, I spent a year in the HR department, and then through a scandal, there was a change up in the leadership in the HR area. The clerk of the court is an elected official, so it was a very political scandal. The replacement to the HR department was a guy who was also overseeing the IT department, and he wasn't really a big fan of big human resources departments. So I found a little spot in IT and kept myself heads down, and eventually found my way into technology consulting, because I was working right alongside technology consultants who said, you'd be great at technology consulting. I said, I have no idea what that is, right? I communicate, but what else could I possibly be? So took a chance and worked for Accenture for about a year. I ended up working with the state of Ohio on a shared services implementation of an HR system. So I found that my bridge between technology consulting and government and politics was not that hard to find. It's just a matter of putting those together. I apologize, my dog. So it's all right. I then found the discipline of user experience research, which in essence is a qualitative research method applied to technology. It's the ability to understand who the users of software are and then design software to delight them or make them happier. It came out of the human-centered design or human-computer interaction discipline that originally was a part of NASA's development of space shuttle consoles. But it has become, in a lot of ways, a buzzword for how you design great software. And so at Emerson Network Power, which focused on the data center solutions that Emerson used to have, they hired me as a user experience researcher. And so I came back to the discipline of social science through working at Emerson. And I worked there for 5 years. I lived and breathed data center infrastructure management, which sounds not all that cool as social science and political science, but got to spend time with really, really smart people and learn the discipline and come back to the value of some qualitative research methods and the ways that user experience research is actually bringing quantitative methods into qualitative. So I've had flashbacks occasionally back to Pat's research methods class in that, because of that, it's just like, I remember some of this stuff. So about 6 years ago, I stumbled upon a little small consulting firm called Levitas, and that's the triangle icon in the corner. I will probably be sharing this YouTube link with my colleagues. So I will give a shout out on the next slide to the amazing designers that work there. But we are an artificial intelligence solutions company. We work with all different types of companies and clients around implementing artificial intelligence. And I've had the role today of being a program manager. I lead the program management team and project management team. I also lead the user experience discipline at the present moment for the company as well. You'll see on the next slide what my day job really looks like. I got my Agile Certified Practitioner certification by PMI, Project Management Institute, back in 2015. So that's a little bit about me and the bridge between my foundations in political science, which I love, and what I'm doing today. And then I'll throw some examples throughout my artificial intelligence stuff as we go to see how those public policy and political science places intersect even in my daily. And then I got a few things to share when we're off the record too. So, all right. So let's start out with what is artificial intelligence? And there's a lot of different buzzwords on the left-hand side. This is a slide that we use quite a bit at our company when people come to the table and think everything is artificial intelligence and what's real and what's still science fiction. Our company actually focuses on two areas of artificial intelligence, which is around data science and machine learning. Which in essence is training computers to analyze large amounts of data to identify patterns and potentially predict information or activities. The second area that we spend time in is the area of computer vision and natural language processing. So computer vision is things like people counting on imagery, facial recognition, license plate detection. And then natural language processing is everything from the chat bots you see on websites today to your Alexa or Siri or Cortana, right? The ability to understand how humans communicate and still gather the information and process it. At the bottom, you'll see what my day job looks like. So I work with really smart people that handle the first two areas at the top, and we make sure that these two things can get baked in reality. So a business comes to us, or a company comes to us, or a city government comes to us and says, I want to use artificial intelligence. We then facilitate the conversation of, well, what problem are you trying to solve? Is that the right problem for artificial intelligence? Let's prove out through a proof of concept, is this possible? And then we then take that proof of concept and make it baked in reality so you can actually use it. Because if you're testing something and it works, then let's go ahead and scale it and make it bigger. So that's where I spend most of my time in trying to solve business problems. I spend a lot of time doing the research that any qualitative researcher would do. Interviews, surveys, and identifying journey maps, workflows, identifying information architecture for software, how do systems integrate with each other and mapping those out. So that's the work that I do. That's the technology consulting piece. That's a part of that. But because we start with business problems that people want to solve, or public interest problems or public safety problems, that all starts with an exploration of trying to tie the future to the present and make sure it makes sense. All right, I'm going to breathe for just a second because I speak very fast. Any questions so far? You got a baseline. This is what artificial intelligence is, right? You've seen Minority Report, you've seen Terminator, not the same thing, right? But some of this technology is coming. So not all of what I'm going to go through next is stuff that I've touched, but I did do some research when it comes to the cross section between artificial intelligence and political science. So machine learning and voting behavior research. It's a fairly new discipline, and most of these articles come from the more of the computer science research, not the political science research. But these 4 articles are kind of the way that technology is looking to try to enhance the ability to understand and predict behavior. The first one is about an exploration of analyzing tweets through natural language processing to predict voting behavior. And this was back in 2013. This is the first article I'd seen where the world of artificial intelligence, natural language processing, merged with political research. And the second article that's here actually took a look at the presidential nominee, or the president that nominated the Supreme Court justice, and looked at 60 years of Supreme Court decisions and accurately predicted with 69% accuracy what those justices would decide in the Supreme Court decisions. So I thought that was a very fascinating piece, right? Which is trying to identify and predict those pieces. I'm sure that somebody could do the same research by a human being, but processing it through an algorithm to validate that, the speed is very quick. And to get that level of accuracy, a human is always going to be more accurate than a machine. And I'll lay that out up front. But the idea of giving a leg up there is a fascinating piece. In 2017, there was an ability to evaluate the Facebook public profile of politicians and the posts that were a part of that to predict voting behavior in multi-party systems. So there was ability to tie a public profile to voting behavior. And then the last one I thought was a fascinating piece, which is how to predict women's voting behavior. And this was an analysis of the Turkish political arena. So it's a multi-party system. And what they found was that ideology and religious values like headscarves, fasting at Ramadan, and praying actually were greater predictors of which party these women chose instead of things like socioeconomic status, cultural indicators, educational indicators, or other demographics. So lending itself towards, the idea that ideology and religious values were there. A couple of different things that I found fascinating. Number one, that a computer came up with the same conclusion that we seemed to come to last fall about the partisan polarization, right? Which is that party affiliation seems to be more about ideology and values than it does about anything involving status, right? But I also found it fascinating that this was really around how women align around political ideology. So all interesting stuff. All right, so that is machine learning and voting behavior research. Again, I haven't seen a whole lot in the political science documentation around leveraging machine learning, but it wouldn't surprise me with the large amounts of data that the ability to give researchers a leg up to have a hypothesis and have a machine learning algorithm give them instantaneous understanding with a percentage of accuracy, let's say of 60%, that your hunch is on the right track. That would obviously escalate the ability to analyze large amounts of data. All right, so this one's fun, right? Which is the understanding of artificial intelligence and public policy. And I use the scales just to try to explain that there's really two sides of the spectrum when it comes to understanding technology and public policy. One is to say, we're still very early, we're still innovating, give us free reign to do anything. And then there's this idea of, is there ethics and should there be some regulation around artificial intelligence? And so these are the top 9 ethical issues in artificial intelligence. You'd be surprised how often some of these ethical decisions really come up in the technology consulting, no matter whether it's a private business or a government entity, to try and figure out the right level of technology and how you train a model to make sure that it's being ethical. I'll use an example that, and it'll be around this concept, the balance between artificial stupidity and evil geniuses. So an example that we use when we describe how artificial intelligence works is around the concept of self-driving cars. Right. So you are driving down the road at 60 miles an hour, and there's a self-driving car driving at the same amount of time. That self-driving car is driving right next to you. In front of that self-driving car, there is a truck with boxes on it, and the boxes start to fall. On the other side of that self-driving car, there's a motorcycle with somebody on it. And behind that self-driving car is a school bus full of children. So no matter which way this car goes, they're either going to hit you, they're going to hit the motorcyclist, they're going to run into these boxes and don't know whether the car is going to stay where it needs to go or go somewhere else, or it's going to slow down and hit a bus full of kids. How do you program a computer to make the right decision, right? And so you have to understand that the computer is going to, usually the algorithm is the least loss of life, right? How do you make sure that the least loss of life is there? Now, depending on whether there's two or just you in the car, it will probably veer towards the motorcyclist. We all know that that probably isn't the human decision we'd make, but it is the one that calculates the right loss of life depending on the circumstances that are there. Those are the kinds of decisions where you say, well, do you want to program that algorithm? Do you want to be the company that programmed that algorithm and then own that, right? That's the challenge that you face. These top 9 ethical issues actually lend themselves to the reason why the intersection between technology and public policy is so critical, right? So unemployment is an obvious choice, right? There's always this fear of, well, what happens when my job goes away? We've heard that even in conversations around the Keystone Pipeline, right? And jobs going away, and how do we retrain them and all those things. So artificial intelligence has the same challenge. Inequality is another one, right? How do you program machines to understand the balance of power and the understanding of inequality? You know, we've talked a bit about the idea of policies that are designed to counteract systemic problems, systemic bias. That's a hard thing for computers to understand. They think in terms of ones and zeros, to kind of adjust that a little bit as you go. And these others are here for you guys to see and obviously spark interest and questions. But there's a lot of different areas here that regulation may be the right choice, but at the very least, it's a responsibility today, because of the least regulation here in this space, of companies to determine whether they're going to take that ethical path or pursue the technology where it lies and put the ethical responsibility on the other. Any questions there?
Are you finding in your conversations with clients that this comes up, or do you find that you have to bring it up, I guess, or does it depend upon the client, I guess, as far as where this lies in the priority of the company itself?
I would say it depends on the client or company, right? So a couple of different things that we've seen. And I think if I were to go ahead and cite something, The Social Dilemma, the movie on Netflix that talks about the ethical officers in technology, sometimes are the loudest voices when they're outside of the company than when they were inside, because for a variety of reasons. Some companies are on this, they've already thought about this and talked about this. Some have not. And so you end up bringing it as a part of conversations. Our company spends a lot of time making sure that we have these conversations up front so that we understand the mandate from our clients on exactly how they want to program their artificial intelligence. We believe it's our responsibility to be at least the ethical barometers of exactly what that client's temperature is. And that's a nice place to be. It invokes trust by our clients. They know that we're not just here to go ahead and push the envelope for the sake of pushing the envelope. Then that's the reason that we focus on business use cases, is so that we're not just trying to experiment. Now we do experiment, right? Then we got robots we play with and models that we build, and we have a great time doing it. But that really is not on behalf of our clients. We really focus on making sure that we're solving the right problems on the right, ethical line there.
According to what they, oh, sorry. I was just going to quickly define. So you were saying your your company as consultants are following the lead of the client. So that's why you have that conversation up front. So you know at what level do you push, which level do you pull back, that sort of thing.
Exactly, exactly. And we also have a line in the sand that we won't cross either, because that's really, really important. We want to make sure that, at the end of the day, we'll go to a certain level, but not any further than that. So
yeah, Adrienne, this is really fascinating. Thank you. I have a question. I guess I'm trying to get a little bit of more of a deep understanding about this slide in particular, and just sort of the overall artificial intelligence and public policy and what you mean, because you're talking about working with clients, and some of them are private sector who might be impacted by public policy. Some of them are government.
Right.
But are you also talking about, are you also going to be talking about like what public policy might be needed to help guide this work? Like, you're talking about interactions with clients, so I get that, and I get the dilemmas, but like, kind of what is the state of public policy with artificial intelligence? I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but I'm trying to understand in more depth what the issues are.
Yeah, you actually teed up exactly where I wanted to go next, which is a case study in this intersection, right? To understand where it's going. Because the world that I spend most of my time in interacting with public sector clients is around the topic of smart cities, right? So the idea of how do you bring technology in, paid for by tax dollars, collect information about citizens, do it in a way that's responsible, and ensure that the public doesn't feel like Big Brother's watching, right? So all of those kinds of pieces, and there's a number of examples. I've got 10 here, which are in essence the top 10 smart city examples out there today. And I have some tangential connections to some of these. For the sake of my company, I'm protected under non-disclosure agreement, so I can't talk about those clients on recording, but I can talk about the conversations hypothetically on how we've kind of talked about those things. So I want to be a little sensitive to that. But we have worked with clients around the topic of autonomous transportation as a public transportation method. We've talked about smart lighting and adding cameras and sensors to smart light poles and all the data that can be collected that way. We've talked about cellular technology, 5G technology, and what information can be captured on your citizens by connecting to those public Wi-Fi's and 5G. So there's a handful of things that I've touched as a part of our conversations with some of our clients. The balance that I've seen is that most cities will take a first pass at looking at the technology and trying to identify the overall value and public interest for the technology itself. What they get bombarded with is this concern over data privacy. So the cross section between public interest and data privacy becomes really hot. An example would be in Canada. I want to say it was Toronto, but Google actually came in to recommend doing a fully networked city implementation, and they were run out through public protest because of the concerns around what data was being captured in that smart city implementation. So that's where I would say that the responsibility of public policy is to ensure that citizens are being treated equally, being treated fairly. There is a freedom, right, of you taking your data where you want to go. Internationally, the regulations around data privacy and the advocacy of an individual owning their own data is a pretty strong policy implementation. It's called the Global Data Privacy Regulation, or GDPR. And that has been a standard that the United States has been talking about, which is that You own your data. You can ask any company at any time to get your data that they have on you, and that company is responsible to give it to you, or they'll pay massive fines to the government for doing so. And that effort of empowering individuals to own the data that's collected on them has made government entities very fearful of some of these technologies, right? So that there is this understanding of regulation coming in internationally that's even impacting the decisions that the United States cities and localities are making. So that's a fascinating, kind of piece here. I have seen some conversations at the federal level around regulation when it comes to data privacy, but there hasn't been a whole lot of consensus on those. Not like there's consensus now anyway, but that's another conversation. The idea of having a consensus around this concept of data privacy and new technology, because they're not exactly sure what they're getting. Most of these technology projects and all of these technology projects, at the time they were proposed, were hypothetical options in a proof of concept state. Very few of them had proved technology with years of experience to demonstrate what kind of data was going to be captured, how they were going to store it, how they were going to understand it, how they were going to make sure that it was protected. So all of this has been an exploration and trial and error by cities and localities to find that right balance. Some are doing it better than others now, but they had a lot to learn as they went through.
Yeah, Adrienne, if I could interject for a second. So at the federal level, so with respect to the federal level and data that the government maintains and controls, okay, as you probably are aware, there's lots of requirements and restrictions and regulations around how we collect it, how we share it, how to protect, private PII information, personal identification. So that's related to data that we collect, and sometimes that also falls sometimes to other entities or communities that we give grants to. Sometimes they're also subject to that as well. I guess what's interesting is what hasn't caught up is the data that private companies, so that's, as I think probably more about than that, but that's the gap. That's the big gap, is that but there are standards in place now. Now I'm not saying they're the most up-to-date standards, and they haven't really kept up with everything, but it does control government data, and it does get a little funky. We talk to companies like in my office, like with Fitbit and stuff, about getting human movement data, and you get into a lot of questions about, well, they don't really want to share data with us, but if they did share data with us, how that would happen, and et cetera. So what rules would apply?
For sure. And I think one of the things to keep in mind, Anne, is that the data regulations that are there are only based on the data that they know that can be captured by your systems, right? So what happens when cameras are put on top of light poles, as an example? Now, those cameras send images to a software solution that can determine you are standing next to this person, right? And then this person purchased this firearm, and then that firearm was used for some crime, right? And so while technically, and the California's been very open about requiring companies not to use that level of granularity on facial recognition to tie a picture to you as an individual and then tie you to other data points. But that data still is there, right? And there's only one state that's been really, really open about not having that be a part of their data collection, data maintenance, and data processing process, right? So those are the kinds of differences between cities and localities, but they still all need to understand that once one does it, they all are going to try to want to do it, right, and try to outdo each other. So there is that sense of that too. So
Wouldn't for law enforcement, some of that would currently, I guess, fall under current rules about how they can collect data and conduct warrants. And it was actually striking me like probably the national security agencies and the federal government, this probably touches a lot, yeah, of what they're allowed to do. But again, probably not the most up-to-date policies.
well,
to
and
go with.
the public use case is an interesting one when it comes to conversations around smart city technologies, because everybody agrees that more cameras would definitely increase the ability for, monitoring and surveillance of communities. And there's got to be some value add there. However, you balance that with the concerns around, I don't want a camera on a light pole that's right outside my room, right? I know you're making my road safe, but I don't want it there, right? Because what else are you going to capture? And that conversation between the public and the government entity, the balance between public safety to privacy concerns, that it really is the huge spectrum, and no different than most other public policy conversations, right? Which is you're balancing the freedom of the individual against the good of the social whole, right? That's not an unusual exploration. We just are using cool buzzwords like computer vision, machine learning, and autonomous vehicles as an ability to have the same conversation.
I think what's going through my head right now is the inequity of it. Meaning, you could be on that flagpole or light pole, whatever, somewhere, thinking you're capturing, a representative sample of people. But really, it's just whoever happens to walk by that day at that time. Do you deal with issues like that?
Sure. The concept of bias in your models is a really, really challenging place to solve it. And again, there are moments when I feel like I'm back in Pat's research method class when you're trying to analyze, right? And this world of bias is a big one. The data science discipline has done a pretty good job of at least identifying early on where bias can occur. That doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't happen, but you need to be constantly aware of a representative sample and what that looks like. So the data capture drives the effectiveness of that model, and models constantly need to be trained. So one of the areas of artificial intelligence that can be a really tough thing to sell is that it doesn't, a model doesn't learn and then it's perfect, right? It might get to an 80% effectiveness of predicting X, but over time, things change, right? People change, cameras change, all sorts of things change. And as a result, those particular models lose their effectiveness over time. They have to constantly be retrained with new data. Some of that takes that bias out, but the selection of that data is hypercritical. And we've had conversations with clients around image capture as being just as critical as what use case you're trying to solve, right? How many cameras do you need? Are you getting the right camera, angle to get the right information? If you're, an example being, if you're counting people, right? You've identified in a picture, you're counting there's this many people. One of the use cases that is definitely out there is this idea of you want to understand how long I have to wait in a line to get something. So you use an image, you count people, and then you send a text message to the people that really want to stand in that line and say, give it another 10 minutes and the line's going to get shorter, you'll be fine, right? Predicting those wait times in a line. But if the cameras are all facing flat like this Zoom call right now, you're getting faces, right? But if cameras are up on top, it's an eye camera, you're just getting tops of heads, right? And so depending on whether you've got tall people or short people, whether the heads have hair or don't have hair. Those are some of the nuances that if you trained your model with all the people having hair, then the person doesn't have any hairs, it's seen as anomaly, it doesn't get counted. It messes with your whole numbers, right? That's the kind of pieces where if you, as long as you pick the right camera, you'll get there, but you got to pick the right camera. You might need multiple angles. That's why drones are part of this. So I can go on and on and on, but that's just one of those, areas where the inequality is as much about the way you capture the data to begin with, and then how you deliberately choose to use it and make sure you've been aware and planned for that, avoiding that bias.
I'll add to your picture. So where the cars are on the street, so I worked with a coalition. I was a strategist for a coalition of government agencies all throughout the tri-state, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, combined with a nonprofit. And it combined all the transportation agencies of these 3 states into a coalition, because people live, for example, like we lived in New York or New Jersey, and my husband worked in New York, for example. So we have a very tri-state area here. And so the coalition that I worked for owned the technology to do 2 things. One, Easy Pass, which if you buy the toll or to pay the toll, and then using that technology to determine how quickly you get from one destination to the other. So it's not just paying your toll, but it's receiving information that then they can plug into algorithms to determine that then, or like Waze, Google Maps, et cetera, can tell you, oh, it'll take 27 minutes to get from A point to B point, or there's a slowdown in this area. And then on top of it, the organization that I worked for actually had their own system, proprietary system, that all of the government agencies in the coalition and the associated government agencies like security, policing, et cetera, then used to manage situations that would occur. And it's quite complicated, but I didn't realize until I started working there that there's a significant amount of data that they collect in 2 ways. One, if you're using Google Maps or Waze or something along that end, they can collect that data, and they have to choose which data is ethical for them to use and which data is to parse out, as well as like an Easy Pass, because they're getting data that is credit card information, your demographics, where you live, how are you paying for, so a whole host of things that can open up this entire world. And this coalition had decided that, and it's very public, there's a public outcry about using Easy Pass data, and will they have access to credit cards? So that then went into this public sphere. There were laws passed. There was still this public outcry. But then even if they addressed all of these issues, they still had to deal with significant amount of misinformation or people believing that they still had access to their credit card information. And I even asked, in learning about it, I said, oh, so you know about my vehicle, my make and number, the model, all this stuff. And they said, it actually comes through in 1s and 0s. So the technology was adapted in a way to protect that privacy. But it was only done after these conversations happened. And the organization that I work with and all the agencies do not use that private data. And they're very public about it, but it required a public relations campaign to sell this technology. So I'll add to your chart a little dot or something along the bottom in that street underneath the cars, because every time you hit over a sensor, you're sending more information via it's like Bluetooth and Bluetooth and a whole host of things that you're sending information that they're then not using to protect the data on that end. It's fascinating stuff.
But those 1s and 0s are being passed for an intentional reason, though, so that they can aggregate counts for those vehicles, right? So if each one has a combination of 0s and 1s for what used to be make and model, Now they can say this many cars came through here. So it still is a counting of vehicles, right, that are coming
sure.
through. So that there's a lot of the ways that people still want to get to the aggregate without knowing, you know, the itty bitty details of that data, but they want to get to how many are using this, how much, you know, volume am I doing here, right? And that's a big part of the data capture. So the last thing I wanted to make sure that I covered in terms of content today was I would be remiss in having any conversations about technology and computers and algorithms with machine learning without talking about Section 230, right? So I did a little bit of research around this. I knew about some of this, and I think I've mentioned on other calls about some of my intersections with this particular regulation in light of the latest on banning, taking down Parler from Amazon Web Services as a response to the type of conversations that were happening on Parler following the Capitol insurrection. So all that to be said, we've talked a little bit about the fact that some of the challenges and some of the birth of the polarization we experience today has to do with the Federal Communications Commission's relaxation of the fairness doctrine or the elimination of the fairness doctrine. At some level, the timing of this Communications Decency Act at the time that the internet was created and coming up to be, there really is this sense that this opened the free rein for that conversation we were having earlier about permissionless exploration and innovation. Because that was really what the spirit of this 230 was let's give a forum for people to speak their minds, but not hold the technology people responsible for what people are saying. Right? And that allowed for the birth of these amazing social networking algorithms that Facebook and Instagram and Twitter all kind of came into this space of innovation because we didn't give them any responsibility for what people were doing on the platform. It programmed their algorithms to work most efficiently. What I will say though, and you know, in this light, is I think this follows that same balance of public policy regulation, right? Which is we found that at some point in time, the space for innovation is done. Now we've gone from innovation to monetization, and it makes those ethical decisions more and more complicated. You know, the goal that I think the company I work for and my colleagues and I have is to ensure that the business of artificial intelligence doesn't get to that same spot, right? Doesn't get to the spot where we've gone from the beauty and innovation, still learning how the tech works, to now all we need to do is maximize it to make as much money as possible. And then the boundaries of what is ethical and responsible end up being a difficult thing to go through, right? And I think, you know, when I think about, you know, the conversations around what social media does in harnessing your network and continuing to create your own echo chamber in these algorithms. This is my personal opinion, but I think it really does have a lot to do with this particular regulation that gave permission to technology providers not to be held responsible for the content that was on their platforms. That's just me. So, before we jump into my two discussion topics, any other questions or thoughts? All right. So I got two questions. I'm going to do this. So the first one is around artificial intelligence. I'm going to stop sharing because we don't need a screen anymore because I can't see your faces and it's driving me nuts. because I'm so used to doing that, right? So my thought was to think about, now that we've kind of learned about artificial intelligence, what's reasonable, what's not, some of the elements around predicting voting behavior, that we talk a little bit about political surveys and polling, right? Because we've talked a little bit about the challenge of surveys and polling being still dependent on exit polls where you see somebody coming out of the polling booth and phone calls, right? Is there room for artificial intelligence to help enhance the accuracy of polling and survey data? What do y'all think?
The technology exists to scroll through. So you referenced it with the Turkish social media case study. I mean, does the technology exist to scour through like Facebook or social media for those posts of people posting, I voted, vote for this person, like advocacy for a particular candidate that then could more accurately predict? I mean, and in my mind, my devil's advocate self is, well, then not everyone is represented on, social media. You're only getting a certain type of demographic, you're not getting people that are technology inept, so, but does that exist that of, and or from what you read of the Turkish example, could you see that moving into that space?
Sure. So I have definitely seen the ability, and we describe it at my company, the idea of artificial intelligence makes the haystack you're trying to find a needle in smaller, right? So it doesn't necessarily find that needle, but if you can make the haystack as small as possible, the odds are going to be better you find the needle you're looking for. So I would say that yes, artificial intelligence, and especially natural language processing algorithms, do a really decent job of taking large amounts of data and making the data that should be important much more top of mind. But it is definitely based on how it's programmed. So I'll give an example. So we've used IBM Watson as part of one of the machine learning algorithms that you can use to process natural language. Watson comes with a number of different libraries out of the box, but in order to create a library that makes sense to you, right? So for example, I want to have a system that scours through a document and tells me every time it says the word fish. Well, it could be fish, it could be fishes, it could be shrimp, it could be snapper, it could be yellowtail, but all of those I need to have. You have to kind of program it to recognize all of those as being fish for it to come that way. And sometimes those relationships are pretty clear and intuitive. Sometimes, depending on your business model, what you do for a living, those connections are tough to find. And so it's all based on how well that algorithm has been programmed to find those things. Even the Twitter example that I used from 2013 did some of that too. It was going through it, that the algorithm first looked for how many said that they voted. Then they identified what they said about things during that time frame, and then predicted their voting behavior based on some of that. So that is definitely a doable technology. I'm not sure the accuracy though, right? So you still need to keep in mind that, machine learning algorithms, if they're at 75, 80%, that's a pretty solid number. Most algorithms at first gate are going to be at 40, 50%. Any other thoughts on surveys and political polling?
One of the things that matters is actually political scientists use terminology models instead of algorithms. But we're really talking about the same thing. And it's the foundational then model, not just how do we, in a sense, what what Adrian was getting at was a measurement issue. How do we count the phenomenon we care about is fish, okay? So how do we take a look at language that gets used and count that particular word as counting for fish? But prior to that time, you have to decide, I care about fish. Fish matter. Fish matter for whatever I'm attempting to predict. And for me, that's honestly, that's actually the more, I mean, I get it in terms of if you're a techie, the question that Adrian went to is the really interesting one. If you are more attached to the substance of what's going on there, you're actually more interested in the model construction that identifies fish. So can you talk a little bit about how that gets developed?
Sure. Sure. To a certain degree, I can, right? So we have really, our data science team are the ones that start with understanding and developing the initial model based on the requirements. But the requirements really come from an exploration of what's important and why is that important. So let me give an example of why, counting fish would be important. So working with a particular government entity who happens to have a lot of beaches. Those beaches have decided to put it, they are asked to provide metrics around the water quality on the beaches, right? If the water quality is poor, they have to close the beach, they have to get people off the beach, the lifeguards have to enforce that, and they have to wait until the water quality is back up to par before they let people back on the beach. So what are the predictors of water quality going down? So they're not having to be reactive, but to be proactive. One of those potentials would be a concentration of a certain type of fish in the water at that moment, right? Same with detecting whether sharks are coming, right? Same. So those are the kinds of problems where then the next piece is, so we don't just want to count fish, we want to count fish in this certain area because the fish themselves are not really the problem you're trying to solve, right? The problem you're trying to solve is what is it as a result of that fish to understand that particular piece. So that is usually in the evolution of the business case. And sometimes it does require setting out a hypothesis and doing proofs of concept or minimal model development in order to understand if it's even significant, right? So you may think to yourself, well, the concentration of fish would really give you that insight. But the truth is that once we prove it out, it may be only 30% accurate. And so it doesn't really give you any more indication of what's going on than sending somebody out there to test the water, right? You haven't really maximized the value there. So then you got to pivot and pick another significant factor to try and get to that same solving conclusion.
So here's the problem, though, and maybe this will give you another horrible flashback to research methods, but it can certainly happen that you just take a look at a bivariate relationship.
Right.
You look at fish and you look at water quality, and you go, oh my God, there's no relationship at all. Fish don't matter. But if you had included another variable and put that into the model, all of a sudden now you find that fish do have an impact there. And if for poor old political scientists, you do that in a trial and error kind of way. Thanks, Jen. I'm not even, there's an easy place to go and I'm not going there. So Right. So it was a standard thing I would tell students is like, if they're working on their senior thesis with me and they try their model, and you start with a really simple model, expect that it's not going to work. And now let's take a look at some other sort of additional factors beyond the one that you had identified as the most interesting one. What if there are some others? Or even if you did find something, okay, let's think about some others. So you go back to the literature and you see what folks have found, and you jump back in. You crank that model, you see what happens with the coefficients of your variables, and then you play with it again, recognizing you're never getting to the model that's, it's Adrian's point. You're never going to do the model where you're predicting 100%. And with human behavior, predicting a relatively small amount of the variance, you're doing really, really well. So I'm trying to imagine the sort of data science analogy or analog to go back to the theory, try something, go back, that iterative process that, mere mortals in the social sciences would use.
Yeah, and can I ask
Does
a
that make
question?
sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, and can I ask a question? I mean, essentially, and this is way oversimplified, but artificial, and then I have another comment about the applicability of this because it's very applicable. But artificial intelligence, it's a method to collect data at one level, correct?
It's actually,
In part?
it's actually more of, it's designed to understand and capture information from things that you normally would not have gotten information from, right?
Right.
But it's also designed, it can be its own data source, right? So the idea is that
But then you analyze it, but you extract it, right? And then you analyze it
that's
for
true.
different purposes, like different models. Yeah,
That
my husband did some work in this years ago. My son actually did some work for a
Nice.
tech company, for Georgia Tech, for a bit. I still don't completely understand it, but anyway. But I guess the other thing I just wanted to bring into this conversation is I think there's a ton of, so there's like technology and public policy intersection, but there's a ton of applications for things like AI, in the public sector. I mean, in terms of, you've mentioned some of them, right? Intelligence. I mean, public health surveillance, while we're trying to collect data and pull data from existing systems, predicting the success, pulling data to sort of predict the success of certain interventions and things. I mean, there's a ton of applicability on this topic.
Right.
To run government programs better, I guess is what I'm saying.
And we've done things with our clients, use cases that never have been thought of before in areas like social distancing detection, PPE detection, air quality detection to determine whether ventilation is moving forward the way through the way it needs to within schools and buildings, to ensure that it's not distributing potentials for COVID spread, right? Those kinds of ideas. So artificial intelligence being in places that, due to a lockdown, humans can't go, you end up having those kinds of conversations quite a bit around the opportunity. One of the things I did want to mention, though, and this piggybacking off of Pat's comment, part of the challenge around machines are much better at taking large amounts of data and running those bivariant models super fast. So the ability to trial and error a model with only a couple of variables is super quick. So what we find in the trial and error space is you cast a wide net, and the challenge is you think to yourself, well, I've got to bring the kitchen sink into the model. so I can figure out what correlates and what doesn't. And the challenge between correlation and causation and not navigating that conversation can be super challenging when it comes to developing these models, because you think to yourself, well, you have all this data, run everything. Well, but is it worth it to run everything? Or do you go to a, one at a time, and each of there's pros and cons for each one. And so the decision of which methodology you start with on a model development effort really is around how many variables you have, your hypothesis of how impactful those variables may be, and how much time you want to spend ruling out variables that really should never have been included to begin with, but you don't know that until you run the model, versus one at a time that becomes a more systematic approach. Computers can do both, but the idea of taking 1,000 variables and reducing it down to 20 potential candidates, that's a really good use of the machine learning algorithms to quiet some of the noise around the variables, versus this is the one thing that I think is impacting. Remember that one thing that didn't work. Let me add another thing and then see. And
I think it's fascinating, Adrienne, but I have to say the analytical techniques that you're describing are not just analytical techniques for artificial intelligence. They're for dealing with all kinds of large data sets in different ways and that are done. So am I correct in understanding, like, the collection of that data for artificial intelligence, you're using all those methods and tools and analytical approaches that it is one tool in the toolbox to look at data and try to understand it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm finally getting it.
And that's, I think, where the tie-in for me around understanding this analytical tools that I learned at St. Mary's, kind of tied into what I'm doing now, right? That kind of idea, I think, was a neat tie-in for me. It took me a little while to see it as I spend time with our we have a chief artificial intelligence officer at our company. He also heads up our data science discipline, and we get into conversations all the time around how he creates his data science models. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I remember deciding some of these models. I know how this kind of works, right? And then he'll complicate it by calling it an ensemble or a tree, and that those kinds of things are. And it's like, I'm not sure it's all that different than the stuff that I remember doing and seeing in the discipline. It's just that humans were doing it and not big computers and algorithms. So anyway, any other questions that I can answer?
I have one more that I thought of. Well, I have two, but I'm waiting till the second question you're gonna prompt. But the conversation, Pat, you could jump in here, I'm sure too. My question I was always thinking about was that you said with your clients or in public policy, you always start with the why. Mm-hmm. Can artificial intelligence tell you what the why is, or do you need the why first in order to receive data or analyze data, or both?
So I honestly think this actually goes back to the comment that Pat made, which is it really does require a human discernment to understand what's significant before going through the exploration of training a machine to find out whether it's significant, right? So there needs to be a filter of what is important. Now, there have been times when I have seen someone say, well, here's a data set. Tell me which things I should focus on, right? And there are some algorithms that if you put that data set in there, it will tell you with a pretty good understanding, this one can correlate to this one in the data set. You take 10,000 rows, the odds are good that the name and the gender are going to be pretty consistent, something like that, right? You can usually do those things. But it's rare that there isn't a problem you're trying to solve before you process that data set. And some of that just is because because everybody comes into it with a hypothesis of some kind, right? It's rare they're coming to you and saying, find me a problem to solve. It usually is, I have a problem I need to solve. Do you think this data set can solve it? And so then that requires, for someone to analyze the data, see where the correlations are, and see if it also ties to solving the problem or proving the hypothesis, correct or incorrect. So I just find it very rare that someone doesn't come with a problem to solve. Now, granted, I work for a consulting firm, right? So for us, the ability to pay our company for the services we provide, you probably need a problem to solve before you come to us, right? That's usually the way that works. But at the same token, that they don't always come in with understanding why they want to solve the problem or what are the best methods to solve that problem. So we come in with a very focused effort to try and peel back the layers of the problem they're trying to solve. And then we also come in with ideally solutions that will help them not only solve the problem today, but look forward to trying solving that problem in the future.
Yeah, I didn't take his research methods class. So my thinking on it was more of on the political science end, or even just application of not just predicting behavior, but more like, let's say a politician could say, I need to know what's most important to my constituents. Like, let's say they're going to be extremely lazy and not have personal outreach to their constituents. Like, and they don't know the why, they don't know what's important, but they know they want. So that's where that was coming from. But even with that, I go back to Pat's comment, which is you try something, you go back. If it didn't work, if it doesn't give you what you're looking for, you go back and you try again. So those were kind of the things swirling in my head, and you both answered it well. So
I'm gonna point something out, and this is certainly one of the things where a supercomputer that can deal with large amounts of data and do iterations of different models can come into play. But I can use the same factor that I think is important in predicting vote choice or any variable of interest. If I then put another variable in there, the coefficient will change. If I put another one in, the coefficient will change. If I put another one in, the coefficient will change. And if I take the third one out, I'll get still another coefficient. So, and you have this depending upon the number of variables, the number of things that you have that you have available, and you want to use them to predict your variable of interest. It's some number factorial, right? It's a big number of all the possible sort of data runs that you would have to do. And that was really where I was going, Adrian, is that what happens, that you can quickly run all possible models, from the individual variables to all possible pairs to all possible triads,
Yeah, it does allow you to do that. But I think, at the very least, you just have to make sure you've tied the right things together, right? I have seen where the assumption is that you have all of the variables you need, and there's like 5 that are missing. And
sure.
Right? So those are the things where the supercomputer won't catch it, and a human eye, unless you're really looking at it, also has a challenging, way to catch that too. So
yeah.
All right. I know it's getting late. Looks like we're having some people kind of drop off. I only had one other question, which was around using artificial intelligence to enhance voter outreach. We can talk about that, or we can take questions about other things.
I want to ask you a question about Facebook. I'm sorry, it's an easy whipping boy, but and you went through kind of the process where initially there's a great interest and focus on how do we make this work, and then how do we monetize it, and then we're going to get around to regulating it. And I'm just going to point out that, and that's exactly the process that occurred, right? You do, and I'm sorry, I'm going to punish all of you remaining by pointing out that this is something y'all should have gotten from the original public policy class. And that's that regulation is hard. Because the entity you seek to regulate will lobby against that regulation, which presumably you're putting in place for the public good, and you can't count on the public to do anything at all to support that effort at regulation, and certainly not to sustain their level of involvement. Okay, so because there was just no regulation much to speak of. I mean, the policy that Adrian put up there is a distributive policy. It's providing a concentrated benefit to Facebook, Twitter, okay? So then you allow them to monetize it and become incredibly wealthy, and now you're going to try and regulate them? You have sown the seeds of your failure, because that was the process that we went through. Does that make sense, Adrian?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that, you know, when we talk about the ethics in the newest and latest and greatest technology, one of the areas that we've seen the most challenge, but the most resistance to really regulate is the world of autonomous vehicles, right? So I happen to be involved in a project around the use of autonomous vehicles for one of my clients, and they ran into challenges because in order to get permission to try out autonomous vehicles in the community, they had to get file a petition with the National Transportation Safety Administration, right? So they filed this petition. It's a timed trial. The technology just didn't took longer than it needed to. They go back to the administration, and the leadership's changed, their philosophy on trials have changed, and everything in between has changed. So as a result, then everything, they had to go through the entire application process again, because they couldn't figure out exactly what type of regulations they wanted today versus what they had done before on the world of autonomous vehicles. And that was directly as a result of 5 other applications that came in that period of time prior to that. So they're really making these regulation oversights of brand new technology, allowing trials in an unsystematic way that gives big companies with large legal teams the ability to get better trial terms than the other guy, right? And that lends itself to inequality. So there's a lot of different challenges when it comes to trying to regulate trial technology. And I truly think that the challenge with Section 230 and any changes to that would have been better when Facebook went from being a college tool to being a public wide tool, if they had started in that light. And that's the one thing that you know, my personal opinion worries me about the artificial intelligence space, is how far do you let the technology go before having those conversations and getting that, you know, getting that in place to ensure it doesn't go that complete other spectrum. So any other questions I can answer?
You want to jump off the recording, stop recording? Does anybody want to ask anything before we stop?
I'm cool with
Yeah.
that.
All right.